the members ourselves at this church give the talks, and we have a planning meeting every quarter that is open to everyone. You can come and brainstorm ideas for talks that you would like to hear or give. And so I just want to give a warm welcome to Ryan. Ryan, come on up. You have the floor. Ryan's going to give a talk on existential risks. Welcome, Ryan.
All right. Thank you, Ruth. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, cool. So I'm going to be giving a talk on this book. It's probably backwards, at least on my screen. The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity by Toby Ord. Let me get my notes up here in the background. There it is. So basically, so just to give a little information, the author is also the founder of Giving What We Can and helped start the effective altruism movement. So you might have heard of those. And if not, well, I won't waste time on it, but they're pretty interesting, so you might want to check those out as well. All credit for the book and the ideas discussed today go to the author, and you can check out his website at theprecipice.com. I can actually, because you might want to pick this book up at some point and read it. It's pretty good. Let's just add that to the chat and then keep going here. Okay, so just a few things, questions to kind of get you started. How many of you have considered the possibility of humans going extinct over the next 500 years? I don't think we really think about that on a day-to-day basis. Did you know what the top 5 ways that we might all perish are? You'll probably learn about those today. And lastly, did you know that we collectively spend more on ice cream in America than we do on preventing the end of our species? So fun facts to get us going. And finally, there's so much detail that's encapsulated in a book that I would love to include, but I cut out most of it for brevity. I'm trying to keep this talk under 30 minutes. But anyone that's interested in kind of more of the fine details and nuances, and basically almost all of the details, should pick up the book, and it'll be laid out in obviously the best format, which is taking a look at that. But let's go ahead and get started. First thing I wanted to note is that this book is actually really optimistic considering the topic at hand. This is obviously talking about the death of everyone we know and love. So, but it takes an optimistic approach, and it lays it out in a very cool, calm, rational, and data-focused, scientifically focused approach. And just says, we have the power to choose to go forward into the future, make the wise and correct decision so that we can mitigate risks of all sorts, which we'll be covering in this talk. So humanity is only about 200,000 years old, but civilization only being around 12,000 years old. But Earth's going to remain habitable for hundreds of millions of years to come, and with ever more time if we manage to reach out into the stars. Safeguarding the future is what this talk is all about. While natural extinction threats exist, technology enables us with the capacity to destroy ourselves, severing us from the potential that the future has to offer. For all our technological progress, humanity lacks maturity, coordination, and foresight that is necessary to avoid making mistakes from which we can never recover. And as the gap between our power and wisdom grows, our future is subject to an ever-increasing level of risk. Over the next few centuries, humanity will be tested. We will either act decisively or in all likelihood will be lost forever. The focus of this talk will be on risks to humanity's potential, which includes the loss of our potential through unrecoverable collapse or global totalitarian lockdown. Anything less than this, however horrible, won't be included here. Finally, we approach this topic with optimism, and the future is not determined. This is not a morality tale, and our choices matter, and we can choose to preserve our future. So to give some just brief perspective, since the invention of the scientific method around 400 years ago, it is noteworthy to point out that the very concept of progress was born. Where narratives of decline, fall, and a recurring cycle were once dominant, a grand project of working together to build a better future grew in popularity. Technological progress has brought us a vast boon to humanity, lifting 17 out of 20 people out of poverty since the Industrial Revolution, for better or for worse. And universal education has raised literacy from 1 in 10 people in the world to 8 in 10. Despite this, setbacks abound, including inequality that is rising and many increased existential threats that we're going to discuss today, among many others that are surely on the top of your minds and are really just too long to discuss and add here. These trends can be hard to believe due to the limits of our lifespan compared to the scale of history. We don't remember a time without basic sanitation in this country, universal education, and worthwhile medical knowledge, for example. There's even a cognitive bias for disproportionately focusing on negative things called the negativity bias. But with all this progress and added risk, it can be hard to separate the good from the bad in technological progress because knowledge itself is not evil. The problem with technological progress is that humanity lacks the wisdom in how to use it. A quote from Carl Sagan presents this well. Many of the dangers we face indeed arise from science and technology, but more fundamentally, because we have become powerful without becoming commensurately wise. The world-altering powers that technology has delivered into our hands now require a degree of consideration and foresight that has never been asked of us. And another quote from a past US president, technological progress without an equivalent progress in human institutions can doom us. The scientific revolution that led to the splitting of an atom requires a moral revolution as well. And that was from Barack Obama. How big then are the risks? Our author puts existential risk in this century at around 1 in 6, which is essentially Russian roulette. We can expect this risk to only get higher with each passing century, unless we get our act together. This is an unsustainable level of risk. And this is why the book is called The Precipice, for we do indeed stand at the edge of a cliff from which there is no coming back. Safeguarding humanity through the dangers I'm about to outline should be central priority of our time. This is not to say that they are the only issues and that we shouldn't focus on everything else. But if you have the skills, this is surely a noble cause to pursue. So what are all these risks that we keep hearing about? I'm going to outline them in just a minute, but it's important to understand that the death of humanity is not the only way for us to lose our potential. I want to reiterate that the society irrevocably collapses beyond repair, or if we get locked into a global totalitarian state, any future worth living for humanity will have been lost. Our sun will eventually expand, enveloping the Earth, and even before that, the rise in luminosity over 1 billion years or so will naturally cause catastrophic global warming. So we've got to get to work on preventing all these things. Another core philosophy to consider are the lives of countless future generations whose lives matter just as much as ours, despite their temporal location. It would be wrong to value people less if they happen to live in another country, the same as it would be wrong to not value your son's or daughter's generation or their following generation and so forth into the vast future. Recognizing that people's lives matter equally wherever they are in time is a crucial next step in humanity's moral progress. This type of thinking has been labeled long-termism. And finally, many reasons exist for our neglect of addressing this important issue. I'll highlight 2 for brevity. Economic theory tells us that existential risk will be undervalued by markets, nations, and even entire generations. While markets are great at supplying some goods and services, they are systematically undersupplying others. For example, public goods such as clean air and existential risk. Protection from existential risk is a public good and moreover a global public good that even nation states will neglect. Even further, you could say it is an intergenerational global public good. Another example is political science, which predicts that our public servants will be incentivized to prioritize short-term issues that mirror the election cycle. So issues that will affect the next 2 or 4 or 8 years and not an entire generation. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and discuss everything that the author could think of that he thought was worth mentioning. So we're going to start with natural risks, and then we're going to move into risks that we impose upon ourselves through increasing technology. So probably the most popular one that comes to mind, asteroids and comets. So it's the classic doomsday Hollywood blockbuster movie, Armageddon, for example. Interestingly enough, this threat has been given a good amount of research. They are broken down by size, and we think that we have found 95%, which is about 920 of all asteroids between 1 and 10 kilometers in size, which are big enough to cause a global catastrophe. And we think we found every of the rest of them with a size greater than 10 kilometers, 4 of which exist that we know of. Comets are a bit harder to deflect, and we actually need to start looking for those as well, as they pose a lot of risk as well. But the damage caused by these is more than just the initial impact zone and the resulting massive wave of fires and energy that destroy the immediate area. It kills us all by essentially kicking up dust into the atmosphere, which then envelops the entire globe and reflects all the sunlight, which then causes all our crops to die. And then we all die of, cold and famine and hunger. So this kills all the plants, but then of course also kills all the oxygen that we need to survive, and et cetera, et cetera. It's bad. And for brevity, I'm going to go through each of these sections rather fast. So our author puts these risks at about 1 in 120,000 for the 1 in 10 kilometer asteroids, and about 1 in 1.5 million for over the 10 kilometers, since there could still be some out there. The next one that we have to worry about, supervolcanic eruptions. So these are larger than average eruptions that cause damage on the scale of about that 1 to 10 kilometer asteroid. And they cause a very similar issue with the immediate area being destroyed, and then all the dust going up into the atmosphere, of course, causing crop failure and famine. It obviously can cause billions of people to starve, and especially given that we only have about a 6-month global food supply. We don't actually know much about these or how to prevent them, so we really need to do a lot more research. The author puts these risk for these, since there's actually a bunch of examples in the book that he covers, some that have put humanity at some level of peril in the past. He puts the risk for 8 to 9 magnitude at about 1 in 200, and 1 in 800 for a 9+ magnitude, which has happened in the past. Next up, we've got stellar explosions. So when a star dies that's out in our Milky Way, it creates a supernova when it's of a certain mass. Some of them just fizzle out into brown dwarfs, but we're talking about the bigger ones. This star is essentially exploding. For simplicity, it's really fun and cool if you want to get into it. But for scale, this giant supernova is much energy that our sun will radiate over its entire 10 billion lifetime in an instant. So if it were to explode near enough to Earth, obviously the scales here, a light year, for example, is still really far away, but if it were close enough, and there are some that are, the most immediate problem is actually really interesting. It's the production of nitrogen oxides that alter the Earth's climate and dramatically erode the ozone layer, the thing that protects us from UV radiation. So if that happens, it leaves us exposed, and that's really bad for us. The odds for this being roughly 1 in 50 million, and gamma ray bursts, which I didn't mention, but are essentially a giant burst of energy similar, is 1 in 2.5 million. So they're really low, but something we need to consider, and I'm not sure with our current technology if we could even do much about, but it's important to keep in mind. So he mentions some other risks that I'm not really going to go into too much detail because they're not going to happen over the next century, which is kind of the focus of this book in the next 100 years. So as I mentioned before, our sun is brightening, and so our sun is actually only going to live about 10 billion years. And over the next billion years, the luminosity, how much energy that's coming from the sun, is actually going to increase just naturally through the way stars live out their cycle as they start to burn different elements and fuse them in their core. So essentially that increases the amount of energy, which has a similar effect on Earth as global warming is now. But of course, it's not something we need to worry that much about in the moment. So there's other risks that aren't worth mentioning, but technological progress is essential to the long term of survival of humanity, since we will need to eventually leave Earth, even though we have a ton of time with regards to that in particular. So I'm going to kind of gloss over the discussion that he has of risk, since it's, math, it's talking about uncertainty, it's talking about maybe survivorship bias, since we have survived for 200,000 years. And we've had a good 5 or 6 mass extinctions on Earth, some of which have been caused by meteors. So it's kind of hard to calculate probabilities when you haven't seen it happen for humanity in another way. So they talk about that in detail. But I'm going to go ahead and gloss over that and move on to the risks that are caused by us and by basically technologies that we've discovered. So first of which, probably one that comes to mind, nuclear weapons. And we've had many close calls when it comes to nuclear weapons. I'm going to only go over one example because there are many examples for brevity. And the training tape incident, which happened on November 9th, 1979. So in the US at 3 a.m., a large number of missiles appeared on the screen at 4 US command centers, a full Soviet first strike. We only had a few minutes to determine a response before most of our own missiles would be destroyed. Senior commanders prepped us to launch back and initiated a threat assessment conference. But when they checked the raw data, there were no signs of any missiles. It was showing a realistic simulation of a Soviet attack from a military exercise that had been mistakenly sent to the live computer systems. And this is just one among many of close calls that we've had. So it's pretty crazy that they would ever allow that to happen. Interestingly enough, the real danger from nuclear weapons at the global scale is not the dust that gets kicked up, but actually from the fires that would rage if we were to send nukes all over the world. The smoke then rises into the atmosphere, above which the rain can actually beat down, and this causes a global nuclear winter, crop failure, similar to the dust, blocking all the light. And it's interesting that the total annihilation due to nuclear winter is actually debated a bit, as it really highly depends on how many are sent, where they're sent, and if some continents are spared, maybe perhaps something like Australia would survive if everything else got destroyed, which would obviously still be terrible, as we would destroy most of humanity. But if we're talking specifically about the grim calculus of existential risk, it's something we absolutely still want to avoid, but there's some debate among whether it would actually kill us all. This doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on it. So there's a few things that go into that calculation. So how many cities are hit? How much smoke does this produce? How much soot is actually lofted into the upper atmosphere? What are the effects on the temperature, light, and precipitation? And what is a resulting crop reduction in yield of food? And then how long do these effects last? And then how many people actually die due to the famine to follow? Ultimately, it's the increasing political tensions in the world that cause these things to become more and more likely. And interestingly enough, the author mentions that arms reductions don't actually reduce the threat that much, because we still would eventually have enough left over to still cause all of this damage. So if you have a million nukes and then you go down to 10,000 nukes or whatever, I don't know the actual numbers, but it would still be enough to destroy everything. Next up is going to be climate change, something you've probably heard about. So a rise in global temperature has actually already occurred, and it's about 1 degree Celsius. So we are actually feeling the effects of that, although of course they're minor and compared to what they could be. It's already causing a lot of damage, but the most extreme threat caused by this is the continual buildup of damages. But there are others that are worse. So theoretically, there's something called runaway greenhouse effect, which is driven by a relationship between heat and humidity. And for brevity, I'm going to skip most of the detail here. This basically causes the oceans to boil off. There's other feedback mechanisms, one of which that I'll mention is going to be the melting of the Arctic permafrost. So when you've got the snow there, it's white, so it reflects a lot of that heat. But the more it melts, the less it's able to reflect, which means it gets warmer, which means it can reflect less, which means it gets warmer, etc., etc. And there's a lot of others I could go into, but again, I'm not going to for time's sake. So for good or bad, we actually don't know as much as we'd like to about this in the science. It's not settled, which doesn't mean we should get complacent, because it could easily be on the worst side of things, but it could also be that the boiling of the oceans doesn't actually happen. But if you look at another planet like, what was it, Mercury? Or no, it was Venus, where this is already happening, and they have that thick atmosphere which captures all the heat over there. So basically, the extinctions come from a lot of different ways, but a lot of the really damaging ones is caused by like direct heat. For example, heat stress. If you think about how we regulate our body temperature, it's through sweating, and that the heat that's around us is dependent on both temperature and humidity. So if the heat gets too high, we can't regulate our temperature, and then we of course die. And so with 12 degrees of warming, for example, half of the Earth's habitable landmass actually becomes uninhabitable without air conditioning during the summer months, which is really not great, because that's where we grow most of our food, and obviously would destroy half the Earth's population and cause mass migrations, which we're already facing through other means in Syria, for example. And that causes a lot of human suffering. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in that direction, which then could easily cause nuclear problems, because through secondhand effects, simply because now the remaining people are fighting for control over what resources are left. So it would cause a lot of increased risk through governments fighting each other. So to kind of stepping back away from that, some actual mitigation strategies involve geoengineering. So you can either remove carbon dioxide directly from the Earth, or you can go up and try to prevent solar radiation from hitting the Earth, which includes either deploying stuff in space, which would be extremely difficult given how expensive it is to put anything into space. And then, of course, there's like really terrible strategies of putting up pollutants into the air to try and block radiation. But this, again, the cures might be worse than the actual climate change itself. So we don't have any good solutions for this yet, other than reducing carbon emissions, which we're increasing our carbon emissions despite the awareness on this issue. And it's become politicized, so a lot of people even doubt that it's a problem. So that's another issue, because the incentives are not aligned for keeping humanity alive versus short-term political gain. So that's a big issue. And then a whole new category, now stepping out of climate change, but into another kind of category, which I'm going to kind of cover really quickly, environmental damage. We could run out of resources. We could run out of fresh water. And this is, again, another existential risk problem, or mainly just things that cause other large effects. Fortunately, the world's population has shown to actually level off once we reach a certain level of wealth and in the population, which has good and bad effects. But as far as nonstop population growth, that's actually turns out to not be a thing. So what else? There's a loss of biodiversity. Some say that we're going through a sixth mass extinction because we've lost about 1% of our species on Earth. But the other 6 mass extinctions are 5. We lost actually 75%. That was probably due to things like meteor. Actually, climate change in the past has wiped out a lot of different species. And from an existential risk threat, the ecosystem services that a lot of the organisms that exist provide, such as purifying the air and water, would be really hard for humans to do on our own. So it's in our interest to keep a lot of that biodiversity. And with that, I'm going to move into the third phase of talking about the risks to humanity. And these are going to be technologies that might be created in the future. So things that don't quite exist yet, but we're on the cusp of inventing. And then beyond that, of course, anything your imagination can think of, because it's really hard to predict future technologies, when they'll happen and whatnot. So With new technology comes great benefits and dangers. And the naive belief that more technology is always better can be disastrous, because we absolutely still need to keep progressing our technologies, as they are vital to saving our species in the long term and improving the quality of our lives, but we need to be really careful in how we do so. Wisdom is needed in addition to extra power, lest it just be wielded carelessly. So here's one that you might have heard of: pandemics. We're in the middle of one, and I don't need to remind you the effects of this. And this isn't even the worst one that we've experienced. Remember the Black Plague that killed a third of Europe? That was a problem. But fortunately, we have improved sanitation, hygiene, medicine, and scientific understanding of disease, which we did not back in the day. And we also have public health bodies that can facilitate global coordination. This prevents plagues from doing as much damage as they used to, but globalization, on the flip side, has actually helped spread them to the entire world, because you've got planes and trains and everything's so interconnected. And also, we're much higher population density. So once it does get into a community, it spreads really quickly. So we've got pros and cons there. And this is just talking about naturally occurring pandemics. We also have to worry about engineered pandemics, which is part of the future risk. So we're on the cusp of discovering new technologies. One of them that we already have is called CRISPR, which essentially, for brevity, it means you can just edit any DNA however you want. The good thing is we don't know how a lot of genes work yet. And so you could make single edits, but all the genes kind of interconnect with each other, and it's really difficult to figure out, but that's not going to be the case forever. And so we'll be able to actually engineer bad viruses as much as we'd like. So let's just put aside for a second the malicious intent for people who would actually want to create something to kill everybody. We actually have a lot of examples of good, well-intentioned researchers that are creating deadly viruses for research's sake. For example, and there are many, but I'm going to listen one for brevity. There's a Dutch virologist who published details of a gain of function experiment that started with an extremely deadly bird flu, which I think kills about 60% of the people who get it. It's untransmissible currently through humans, but he did an experiment where he passed it through ferrets. I don't know how many, but by the last one had a version of that could easily be transmissible between mammals. So that's problematic, because they are done in secure labs, but their track record hasn't always been great. There are also a number of notable laboratory escapes that are included in the book, and which include a lot of things that we really don't want, like, for example, a weaponized version of smallpox and anthrax. And so for brevity, I'm only going to mention one in detail. So in 1971, a Soviet bioweapons lab tested a weaponized strain of smallpox on an island somewhere, I'm not going to mention, but during the field test, they accidentally infected people on a nearby ship, who then spread it ashore, and the resulting outbreak only killed 10 people before being contained by a mass quarantine and vaccination program. But as you can see, these things should never happen, but they do. And that's a big problem, because they're not as secure as you think that they might be, because as humans, it's really easy to overlook things, or things to go wrong that we didn't account for. So for good or bad, biotechnology is actually becoming more and more available. So students and amateurs now have access to more and more cutting edge techniques, and the pool of people with access to these techniques is growing, which has potential for good as we dramatically increase our research capacity. But as you know, with proliferation of something, more and more risk, because then you expose to people who may not have good intentions. Or again, with good intentions, but accidents happen, especially if it's going out to amateurs. So fortunately, we have outlawed bioweapons, but it doesn't really matter, because the Biological Weapons Convention, where they outlawed this, I think in the 70s or 80s, it only has 4 employees and a budget that's smaller than your average McDonald's. So we're not doing great on that front. And they have no effective means for observing compliance. So it's more of just a gesture. There's a bunch of examples in the book of where both the US and Soviet Union, for example, are researching bioweapons. So nothing has happened really big yet, but that's not eliminating the possibility. And if you didn't know, the DNA for smallpox is readily available online. So this creates an information hazard for not only the pathogen itself, if you were to have smallpox get out, it can escape the lab, but also the information on how to create them and publish those techniques. They're actually been published online for you to go take a look at. So you could go look up the DNA and the technique for how to resurrect smallpox in the 1918 flu, for example. So again, not great. Unaligned artificial intelligence is next, trying to keep everything brief. This is talking about AI. Basically, think Terminator, but without the robots walking around trying to kill you. And for brevity's sake, I'm going to treat this lightly. Computers essentially can learn for themselves through deep learning, and they can already beat us at chess and Go and all of our grandmasters, and you've heard about that. Most likely. And when you actually survey the 300 top researchers in the field, they said that a machine with greater intelligence than our own is the bar that they set. And that's coming with a 50% chance by 2061. And 10% of those top 300 researchers think it could come as soon as 2025. So this is going to cause major problems, because if someone who has our level of intelligence, think about your job, it can just take that right away. For example, and that's not even an existential threat, that's just a society kind of upending thing that can happen. The bigger problem with this, which we're going to focus on since we're looking at the existential threat kind of view, is going to be trying to align it with human values, and that is extremely difficult. So again, for brevity, we're just going to take a look at the reward function as an example of this. And when you program this to think, well, what does it actually want? We get our normal stuff because we're human, we want what we want. But when you program something, you have to give it what it wants, what its reward function is, what you want it to do, what all this learning is kind of aiming for. And so you can't just turn it off, because part of its own reward function is going to be like, wait, if you turn me off, I can't get whatever resource you ask me to get. So I'm going to resist being turned off, because that's what you told me to do. You wanted me to do this thing. So it is going to actively resist that, and trying to code that in is extremely difficult. And actually understanding what our priorities should be is extremely difficult. So basically, that's a big problem. And if the AI that we create to help us, as we are already introducing more and more, limited AI, for example, is already in existence and being distributed because it's really beneficial economically. So if an AI, though, that crossed that threshold got access to the internet, it can obviously just scatter itself around and to all the world's hard drives, make countless copies of itself. And the only way to get rid of that is to ask every country and every person to delete and destroy their hard drives, which would destroy any information that we have, and good luck trying to do that. So the problem isn't that it would be Terminator and it would take control of tanks and destroy everybody, at least not yet with the current technology we have, because we got automated turrets and stuff, but it would basically act as an underworld organization, but extremely effective. It could hack anything, it could then get money, and then bribe people, blackmail people, and do anything like that really effectively. You could just be like, hey, here's $1 million. You want to just go turn a switch? And to the person, they'd be like, oh, sure, $1 million. It can't be that bad, except that it's manipulating that person and not telling them the bigger story. They probably would come up with a great tailored message to make it seem like not that bad. So the whole point of this is, if a single person with a human level intelligence like Stalin, Hitler, Genghis Khan can scale up global power, a superintelligence would be able to as well. And so you can kind of think of it in those terms of how it could kind of control humanity and kind of stop its potential from going forward. Among others, obviously eventually replacing humanity if it were that intelligent, because good luck trying to control something that's smarter than you are. It's a really hard problem. But again, for brevity, I'm going to go ahead and move on to dystopian scenarios. So normally when we think of existential threat, we think of how we might all die. But in this case, it would just be a future not worth living. So think of global totalitarian lockdown, if like North Korea got control of everything. There's tons of examples in history of kind of bad things happening, and he kind of breaks them out into three different things. We've got undesired dystopia, enforced dystopia, and desired dystopia. So gonna go in just really briefly into these. We've got enforced dystopia, which you're going to be familiar with. It's going to be like Hitler gaining control of the world. And the problem with this is that with the new technology that we have for detection and surveillance, they'd be much more effective at undermining dissent, detecting dissent, just surveilling everything. So surveillance state, something you might have heard of. And so we can't rule that out. And AI is going to contribute to that dramatically. Limited AI is what I'm talking about, at least currently, where they can be put out and used to kind of control a population. Fortunately, we can use those technologies to fight that. So it's not completely pessimistic, but it's something we need to keep in mind. We've got undesired dystopia, which comes from effects that I'm just going to briefly go through. The prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of the common, which for brevity, I'll simply say that the individual incentives that we all have could drive us all to a collectively terrible outcome. And last but not least, the desired dystopia, which comes from an idea that we would enforce and indoctrinate others, and combined with that enhanced surveillance, again, could dominate the globe. So something that comes out that seems like a good idea that we think we all want, like communism, for example, or any other number of movements, would then, because we have so much more information technology and persuasion technology, it would just come to dominate the globe, shut down dissent, shut down discussions, destroy free speech, which are the only things that can kind of counter that. So we have to keep rational, rigorous debate alive, free speech alive. Otherwise, we can get locked in to a bad ideology. And that's what the author is talking about. He's talking about locking us in to something that will kind of dominate the narrative of humanity. It could be for 1,000,000 years. And even if we eventually break out of that, it might even be too late to really have humanity recover from that. So coming near to the end of this now, there's a couple other things he mentions for fun. Really not serious threats yet. So nanotechnology, which could create tiny self-replicating robots, which could in itself become a new super weapon, because then you would deploy them and they would just destroy whatever you want. We've got the contamination of extraterrestrial life that could exist on a planet, even in our own solar system, like Mars. This is one that we take actually really seriously. So any samples that are sent back from our probes are put into heavy containment. So we are at least thinking about that. Obviously, aliens could come and destroy us all. It's a classic one. Not much we can do about that. And then finally, one you might not have thought about, but radical scientific experiments that could kill us all. For example, the super collider they were talking about, could create a micro black hole or something. We just don't know what we don't know. And so there might be risks that we're just really unaware of, because you go back 100 years ago, we wouldn't have thought about nanotechnology even being a thing. And yet it's something that we need to learn to forecast for in the future as disruptive technologies kind of appear. And so lastly, something fun is the Fermi paradox, which I won't go into in detail, but it essentially asks, why are we alone in the universe? There could be technologies that once discovered make intelligent life extremely difficult to kind of pass hurdles. So if there's a technology, it could even be the surveillance technology that we're developing now that makes progressing into the future really difficult. Or it could be the discovery of the engineered pandemics, which inevitably, without really good surveillance and control of knowledge, causes one single person to destroy life on Earth. So that's going to be a big problem. And then, so moving on from that, that's going to be a complete summary of what the author could come up with. And he actually has Okay, the risks breakdown, which I'll actually give you in a minute. But again, he actually summarizes all the combined risk, and this is, using statistics and whatnot, summarizes it down to 1 in 6, because each individual one has its own threat. But I'm going to go ahead and skip all that. It's really a little bit not the point of this talk. So he outlines a grand strategy, which I'm just going to really briefly cover. Number 1, we need to reach existential security, which means controlling these unmitigated threats and kind of researching and putting towards institutions that can actually manage research and reduce and advocate policy to bring them down to a manageable level of risk. We're not talking about 0, but we are talking about less than, or less chance of dying than 1 in 6. And then 2, once we become secure in our existential threats, a period of long reflection where we stop focusing on, we fix all of the bad things that are happening to us, like poverty and et cetera, inequality. And we actually start thinking about how to make humanity better and better and better, and how we might expand into the stars and create societies that are worth living in, and create prosperity, because that's what we want for us all. So the third being achieving our potential. It's pretty obvious. We have tons of time. If you look out into the stars, we could colonize all of these planets. We've got trillions of years where we could proliferate and propagate and create human well-being across the planets and stars. We only need to achieve that without falling into these traps that I'm outlining. So there's a couple challenges. So how do we achieve this? Really briefly, we need better institutions. These institutions that we have currently are built to overcome small and medium scale risks. They do not consider the long-term impacts for humanity. And second, we cannot fail even once, because if we fail, that means we're all dead or locked into a totalitarian state. We really can't learn from trial and error as we usually do. That's like what we do as humans, trial and error, except the error would kill us all. So we can't afford a mistake. And 3, the small risks that we would kind of push off to the future become more and more relevant as we go. So the 1 in 1 million chance of tomorrow becomes a bigger threat today, because the technology for it becomes relevant and sophisticated and dangerous. So we need to integrate and improve our forecasting for disruptive technologies into our policy making, so that we can account for them as we go and not as they kill us all. So something to keep in mind, we're going to need global international cooperation, and that's difficult. And for brevity's sake, all I'll say is that there are problems with a world government, because then you have the problem of a total totalitarian threat. But we do need a basic minimum collaboration that puts safeguards and has institutions that can forecast and actively work on these problems, that actually have a budget and actually have some amount of power to keep people in check. That's not going to be easy, but it's what we need to do to help mitigate the threats that are many to humanity. And now I'm going to go ahead and tell you the final risk tallies for all of these. So we've got the natural ones coming in from asteroids and comets in 1 in a million. We've got supervolcanic eruptions at 1 in 10,000. Stellar explosions, that's that star exploding, 1 in a billion. And for a total natural risk of 1 in 10,000. And then we've got the ones I just outlined on how we can kill ourselves. That's going to be nuclear war, 1 in 1,000. Climate change, 1 in 1,000. Everything else from environmental damage, 1 in 1,000. And this is over the next 100 years. By the way, for all of these estimates. Engineered pandemics, 1 in 30. Naturally arising pandemics, 1 in 10,000. Unaligned artificial intelligence, he puts at 1 in 10. Unforeseen anthropogenic risks, 1 in 30. That's anything we didn't think of. And other as 1 in 50. So he puts the total risk for us killing ourselves at 1 in 6. And then 1 in 6 compared to 1 in 10,000, basically it goes down to 1 in 6 as the math works out. And the last thing I'm going to read before I conclude, two things actually. What to not do. We need to not regulate prematurely, because we need to reduce existential threat, but we don't really know how, so we can't enforce regulations before we really know how, so we need a lot more research. We need to not take irreversible actions unilaterally. And I'm just going to go over these really fast. Let's not spread dangerous information, all the techniques for killing ourselves online. That makes it really easy for everybody. So let's not also exaggerate the risk, because if we do that, it then plays into our natural human tendency to just dismiss it. As soon as we start exaggerating for purpose of marketing or whatever, it causes people to just not care. So we need to be careful about that. We need to not be fanatical about it. We need to keep a cool, calm mind and not just become zealots about it. We need to not be tribal. We need to come together eventually as humanity so that we can move forward. And otherwise, we'll end up just destroying ourselves. We need to act with integrity, because if we don't, and if we prioritize the needs of every individual, tragedy of the commons and all that, we end up destroying ourselves. So we need to come together and not despair. We need to not ignore the positives, which goes against our human biases to focus on the negatives. But there are a lot of things to be hopeful for. There's a lot of potential to do good. And the last thing I'll cover is simply what you can do. So you've heard all the problems. You're probably a little, at least worried, as you should be, because these are not things we think about every day, and that's good for your mental health. But what you can do, as far as his influence, he's recommended you go to their website. It's called 80,000 Hours, and it basically is the idea that you only have 80,000 hours in your career, and you can use that to do good, and it kind of provides resources to kind of help you think about, global priorities and what you can do and how you can kind of contribute to each of these individual causes. Obviously, you can donate money to your favorite topic of how you think we're going to all die. And then finally, remember that a single person, if you do dedicate your career to this, can invent a technology that can change the world. We've already had people invent things that have been, like birth control, for example, as the author brings up, just tons of technologies that can really impact everybody. So be hopeful, realize that you can make a difference, and we have the tools to choose to create a future that doesn't go away. And if we want, as humanity, we can choose to keep going. Because if we don't, the unmitigated risks, and as we're currently moving on to the future, they just become too deadly as we go, because the risks are actually increasing and not decreasing. The more we continue without wisdom and increase our power. So that's my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Ryan. Can everyone unmute temporarily to give him a hand? So virtual hand.